So in August, we said to ourselves, we've learned all this stuff, what should we do now? And we said, you know what, enough with the incremental tweaks at the margin, let's get crazy. And so we started making some big bets with very small tests around minimum viable product. And what we did was, the first one is, you'll see like this test right here. We basically made we brought in a product consultant, we made this totally hacked little test to see if people were willing to do two things. To see if they were willing to tell us what their business challenges were up front without like that Q&A forum. And two, if they were willing to list the contact information for other people in their professional network for us to get a sense if there was some kind of interesting viral coefficient that might be compelling in building a business. We sent this just to people from our existing mailing list who we knew to work at startups, which was a couple thousand people, and the results were awesome. What we ended up doing with that is knocking down our whole pre-existing product like pretty much completely. And in September of this year, we introduced High Table 2.0. And so High Table 2.0 is what we're working on right now, what I described to you guys as this sort of LinkedIn with a purpose. We are going exclusively after funded entrepreneurs and startup leaders and the investor communities that are kind of aligned around them. Since we've done that, a couple of things have happened. We have 68% usage of the product right now. As I mentioned, with the last product, the usage case was actually under 10%. The viral coefficient, it was over 0.5 within the first 2 weeks of launch. The way we do this is actually an awesome hack for you guys. We literally, when you sign up, we tell you that you need to give us between 2 and 5 vouchers to vouch for you as a leader in the startup space, whatever else. We have it connect through a LinkedIn OAuth. It gets deployed to them, and people get it, and they're like, what the hell is High Table? And they come, and for one reason or another, they sign up. We don't even say that much on our website. And then the other big thing is, because we have this homogenous community, we're actually able to deliver on getting people answers and getting answers quickly. So right now, regardless of how hard the challenge has been, 70% of our fulfillment of those answers has been in under 5 days. So, we've had some crazy people. We had a VC who wanted to learn about the biology, molecular biology around certain types of cancer detection. We were able to go out and find someone else who had done like a health tech startup who could do that. So it's been pretty cool. So what was the biggest lesson of all from all the stuff that we talked about? To keep it simple. The big thing is that you need to decide what actually qualifies usage. I think one of the deceiving things that we had is prior to building out an analytics function around High Table 1.0, we had like a database team looking at our numbers, and they're like, actually, like the numbers are pretty good. Like we have this many follows this week, like they're way up. Follows were meaningless. They really didn't matter, and for that reason, I always tell people to beware of false engagement metrics. You have to think about it. Like a lot of people will actually argue, even in the world of Facebook, a like is somewhat non-consequential. Like, what does it really mean? Like, it may mean things for brand, but like, really understand if that's ultimately a measure of engagement or not. And you need to look at the data to understand that, because the answer may be yes or the answer may be no. But really understand what's happening there. The next thing is to start with one thing and layer up. Rome wasn't built in a day. The example that I always like to give here is like if you think about the early days of Facebook or LinkedIn, they were really simple. I joined LinkedIn in 2006. I had 7 connections. You couldn't do anything on the product. There was nothing around LinkedIn today. I don't think they had photos, actually, now that I think about it, at the time. Totally different product. And what they did is they went out and they saw a core value prop of, do people want to connect with other people and look at profiles of other people they do business with? Yes. Once they validated that, they went out, they layered on, they layered on, they layered on. That is the right way to think about at least scrappy product development, because otherwise you end up in a situation like what I just mentioned, where we spent 3 to 4 months kind of completely decomposing what we had worked on to really figure out what had worked. So when you think about growth hacks, you can move really quickly. Just start small and layer up from there. So that's kind of the story of High Table. It's interesting, it's compelling. The stuff that will be even more compelling to you guys is to move on to the Pirates. So Dave McClure, he talks about this startup metrics for Pirates framework. So for those who haven't heard it before, there's basically 5 buckets. There's acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these things. I'm going to give some examples of some hacks that I've kind of done to optimize against all of them in the past, and also talk quite a bit about why they're important. Some of the stuff may be a little bit redundant to you guys, but hopefully there's nuances that I can bring up that will resonate with you in some way. So the first on acquisition is you must invest in infrastructure. And what I mean by this is a lot of times, like when people think about growth hacking, a lot of times they think about it from the perspective of like optimizing toward the top of the funnel and to getting leads in the door. A text link on the Yahoo homepage in 2006 was $37,000 remnant for one day. It was crazy. But it worked really well for us, and we actually got like a CPA off of it of probably under $2 for an email address. Whereas we thought like going out and getting all of these display ads that we were buying super cheap on the remnant platform were going to be the winner. They weren't. Same thing on Facebook. Don't make a generalization that it doesn't work, because an ad around like, hey, senior citizens in Boca Raton, like performs very differently than like, hey, recent Georgetown alum in the East Village, go do X, Y, and Z at this bar. So you really need to understand the creative, the placement, the kind of framework I always get people to think about is a basket, a carton, and an egg. So the basket is sort of the overarching venue of where you are. So the basket in the Yahoo example would be just Yahoo. The carton is sort of like the placement within that venue. So the carton with Yahoo would be sports or news or the homepage. And then the egg is like the individual creative. So is it a text link? Is it a 300 by 250 ad? Is it red or blue? So on and so forth. All stuff that's really, really important to think about. The next big thing to think about with acquisition. Everyone talks about CPA. I tune out when someone starts talking to me about CPA because I don't know what they're talking about. There are two types of CPAs, and they're fundamentally extremely, extremely different. So you can call them what you want to call them. I call them CPAR and CPAC just to keep it easy. R for registrant, C for a customer. Whether it's a customer, however you want to think about it, it needs to be someone that somehow drives revenue for you so that you understand if the CPA is really worth it or not. And the example that I give here is that a lot of people will say, hey, we're actually really good at acquisition. Our CPA is $10. Well, that's great, but how many of those people are actually converting into paying customers? Because actually, if none of them are, let's say that you spend $100 and you get 10 people in the door, so hey, it's a $10 CPA. Well, actually, you're getting nothing out of that if none of them actually convert into a behavior that you want to see. So the example that I give here is like, you might think that your CPA is $5, but if there's only 5% customer conversion, the cost for actually getting the customer is $100. That's fundamentally a really, really different thing and something to think about early. The growth hackers out there think about this the minute the money goes out the door. And what I mean by that is a lot of times historically, people spent like a month's worth of money on advertising, and they went back and they go, okay, we're going to do the month-end reporting, we're going to see what works, we're going to see like how many of those people activated, so on and so forth. That's fine and dandy, but if you've spent $200,000 and you're waiting until the end of the month to see what works, like that's a pretty major problem. So what you can do is you can use your historical data to understand a little bit about what customers do and try to project out what your numbers look like. So this chart is called a customer intake curve. A lot of businesses have them. Basically what it is it says, of all the people who will ultimately buy from me, when did they buy for the first time? So when do they activate as a customer? So in this chart, it's basically saying, actually, of all the people who ever buy, close to 55% of them buy on day one. That's probably pretty awesome and a rarity, but you know, it could happen. What they do from here is then they use this measure to estimate out what the total projected conversion might be from a cohort. So what I mean by that is, let's look at this little example on the right. Let's say that I go and spend $100 on Google and I get 10 signups, like I mentioned before. I have a CPA of $10, a CPAR. Now I know from my historical chart that, let's say that this chart, the day one number was on 20% versus the 55. What I know is that historically, of all of the people who become paid customers, 20% of them become paid customers on day one. Now, I can't fast forward into the future and know what's going to happen in the next 30 days, but I do know what happened today. And I know today that I had one purchaser on that first day, so I can extract out that I expect that that one is really just 20% of what's to come. So that I expect to see 5 down the line, so my forecasted CPAC is actually $20. So again, it's like it's not going to be ideal, and you need to go and you need to refine these curves probably at least on a monthly basis to understand what's happening. They also vary significantly by channel. For paid search, the intent is just a lot higher. You're going to see a lot more day one activity than display or other channels, so you need to be really, really cognizant of that. But this is a way to shut down worthless advertising spend before it gets completely out of control. And the other thing I always tell people is do this, and then certainly in 3 months and go back and look at all of the media you ran or all of the, all of the sweepstakes campaigns, whatever else were out there, and then do a kind of a retroactive assessment of how they actually performed. If it turns out that it performed like a totally different channel and actually the downstream CPAC is pretty good, you can always go back and rerun it. There's no need to be running something consistently, perpetually through time. So once you have these people in the door, we hinted a little bit about activation, right? You want to get the lead in the door, but then you need to get them buying something or engaging or whatever the metric might be to you. So with activation, the big question becomes, how quickly can we get the customer to do what we want them to do? The big thing that I tell people here is to make sure you know what makes sense for your business, because these guys mentioned that I do a lot of teaching. I do a lot of teaching around B2C analytics, and then I'll get people who send me an email afterward who are like, oh my God, like I only had 0.1% of customers who buy on day one, but they're a B2B business. If B2B businesses were obsessive about day one activation rates, it would mean that most salespeople and account managers would be out of jobs. So you need to think rationally about what makes sense for your business. For B2C, it might be what does trial look like that first day. For B2B, it might be within 30 days. You also need to understand like what constitutes activation. So is it a purchase, or is it like for Twitter, is it the first tweet or the first follow of someone else in the Twitter network? Is it, for someone who's B2B, who's post the sale, do you want to look at the first time that they have an account management call, or the first time they ship out a support ticket? There's a number of different metrics that may make sense out there, so it doesn't always have to be about dollars and cents is the point, and it never has to be as quickly as you might think it has to be. The other thing is that you need to understand what's called bow tie or two-sided marketplaces and what impact that has on things. I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about supply and demand, particularly in e-commerce, and what impact this has, but the availability of inventory or the persistence or integrity of a community online can actually have a major, major impact, either positively or negatively, on what customer activation looks like. For magic numbers, what I mean by that is there's a lot of a lot of times I'll say statistics and people just look at me and they're like, stop right there. There's very basic statistical regression you could literally do in Excel that will show you the relationship between two different types of numbers that can derive magic numbers. So the example I always like to give is Facebook a while back was like, how do we determine once a user is here to stay? So they looked at a lot of things around like their posts, their likes, their friends, basically every kind of activity you could have under the sun. And they came up with a number that was the only number that matters is the number of friends someone has. And that number is 8. Once they have 8 friends, enough stuff starts to populate in their newsfeed where the experience starts to become more compelling. And hey, they add more friends. And hey, maybe they post their own thing and they go out and they do all these other things. LinkedIn has the same thing. They have a magic number of connections. There could be a magic number of page views or a magical time on site. You want to think about all that stuff and how that dictates into getting users to do what you ultimately want them to do. So going to the example about supply and demand, I want to show you guys an example from Savored. So as I mentioned before, Savored operated in 10 markets, and they were all very, very different markets for us. So we got our start in New York City. In New York, we have close to 400 partner restaurants that we worked with. In Denver, which is a newer market, we were working with only 13 restaurants. Think about your experience as a user on day one when you have 400 things to choose from versus when you have 13 things to choose from. Inherently, you can't compare those two groups of people. And what happens with a lot of businesses is they go in and they'll say like, oh, this number just sucks across the board, but they won't go in and break down what's happening in different components of the business. The best example I could think of for this is like dating sites. Like there are some cities that skew heavily female, right? So for them to go in and look at the activation rate of females who have like a lower selection of males to choose from or other women or whatever they're looking for, you can't do that. You have to understand what forces are present in that marketplace and dial back your expectations accordingly to really understand what's happening. So another example I want to give from Savored on this is this chart basically looks at, on the right axis, it's the number of restaurants that we had on the site in New York City at one particular point in time. And on the left axis, it was the propensity to make a restaurant reservation within 24 hours of joining. You'll see that as we increase the number of restaurants that were on there, that propensity to book in day one, not surprisingly, went up materially. Now, I talk about other markets like Denver, I could talk about other smaller markets like Boston. We saw the same trend there, but the number was a lot lower. It wasn't to the tune of 8%, it may have been to the tune of 3 or 4%. So you really want to track that and understand what's happening, because then it may not be a marketing issue, then it may be a sales issue. That's where kind of like the growth hacker can kind of come in and say like, well, what impact does this have on other parts of my business? Like if it's an e-commerce site, maybe you need to go out and talk to your suppliers and start getting stuff that's a little bit more relevant. The other thing is, business isn't just about marketing. There's a lot of reasons that different things can happen. I'll talk a little bit about this in a little bit, but you need to recall that There's other stuff that can happen that's out of your control that can lead to a really bad user experience that can really screw up activation. So this example is actually one of my favorites, where last year during Cyber Monday, Bonobos crashed for like 3 or 4 days, and they're a retail business, right? So that month should be like their bang up month of the year, and if you look back at their historicals, it was probably one of their worst. And that was because of this whole issue. But not only did their website crash, they ended up like also charging people for stuff that they actually didn't buy. A lot of crazy stuff happened, right? And they issued like this whole apology about it, whatever else. But at the end of the day, that's really going to piss people off from like both an activation and a retention vantage point. So you need to be thinking about the business holistically, about things you can prevent against, and then also things you can go back and kind of plug holes against disasters that may have happened in the past a little bit. So on that note, I want to talk a little bit about retention, and there's 3 things that I want to talk about with retention. The first is email and mobile retention, which is really like falls in this bucket of push. The next is product pieces of retention, which comes more in the bucket of pull. And then the last thing I want to talk about is thinking about delighting your customers and thinking about customer satisfaction, or CSAT, and Net Promoter Score, and how that actually can play into retention. So starting with push marketing, Saver provided like a lot of great examples for things we did right and things that we did wrong with push marketing. In markets where we were smaller and we only had 15 restaurants to start with, people may have come on and been like, these restaurants suck, I don't want to eat here, I'm like not going to look at anything again. By then going back and getting like one or for each additional restaurant we got, there was a higher propensity that something might resonate with them. So our email strategy every single week was sort of send these emails that are like, new this week, now we have Le Cirque, and maybe that resonated with someone and they'd come back, and get it in the subject line. So I mentioned I did some work for Hawaiian Airlines a couple years ago. We did something where if you started the flow of booking a ticket to Hawaii and you were logged in and you abandoned off that page, we sent you an offer with like a very minimal discount. It was like a 5% discount. That email alone ended up doing over $14 million in annual revenue for Hawaiian Airlines, which is insane. And it was sort of the same thing at Saver. We got into the business of like, we did some flash sale event type stuff at like Hill Country and stuff like that. And right before the offers would expire, we'd go onto Google Analytics, we'd pull a list of all of the user IDs who had ever looked at that page, and we'd say, last chance, you only have an hour left to buy this stuff. And sure enough, that would move through most of the rest of our product. And that's why like the abandonment stuff you guys see when you get retargeted around the web, like how often do you look at a pair of shoes and then like for 2 weeks that pair of shoes like follows you around to barnesandnoble.com or weather.com or whatever else. It's the exact same thing, but you get annoyed when it happens that way. You get less annoyed when it happens in the email box because you're like, oh, interesting. Like you don't think that it's quite as calculating as it is in the display ads. The next thing is what I call shameless manipulation of consumer demand. So I talked a little bit about building relevant content for people when you're presenting something on your website or your email or whatever else. I talked a little bit about that company Sailthrough before. I'm going to tell you the reason I like them a lot. Most people in this room have probably read Business Insider. If I go on Business Insider and Conrad goes on Business Insider, we're going to see 2 totally different experiences because we've read different articles and we've engaged with different articles through our emails or whatever else. And what they're basically doing is they're tracking what, there's tags on all the articles on the website, and what are the thematic tags of the articles I read versus the one that he reads. So maybe I always read articles about B2C, venture capital, and startups, and he always reads articles about enterprise and software. It's going to be really different. So you want to find ways that you are surfacing up that demand, and what that particular tool lets you do is it has like a kind of a white label recommendation algorithm that puts out relevant content. But the cool thing that you can do is you can let it surface all of that relevant content, and then you can just shove in the stuff that you want to sell, and people kind of borrow brand equity from the stuff that's relevant to them. So the example I always give is like, when we were at Saver, we had a ton of really awesome restaurants, and we had a couple of like somewhat mediocre restaurants. And so we put out this digest of like 12 restaurants and put like 6 Michelin star winning restaurants in it. And then we put in this like random restaurant that may have been like in a Holiday Inn in Midtown. People would be like, I don't know that restaurant, but if it's next to Le Cirque, it's got to be pretty good. And get them to go there, and it would drive business for the B2B client. So there's stuff you can do around manipulating what you show people and what you put beside things. It's a classic like offline marketing thing where you borrow brand equity from one thing and just kind of deploy it and transfer it to something else. The last thing that I want to mention is optimization. A lot of people this is a grow hack talk. The fundamental core of grow hack is optimizing. And the example I like to give, like in the Sabre case, is when we first started, our email strategy was like pathetic. There were like 5 of us. Once a week, we would send out an email that was like, now presenting restaurant X. And then we started like getting some more. We're like, okay, well, we could shove like 4 restaurants into like an email and see what happens, so on and so forth. And so we started doing some analysis around, well, every time we feature a restaurant in an email, how many incremental reservations does it get versus a restaurant that wasn't featured in an email? And what we found was when a restaurant was featured in an email by itself, it got 12 more incremental reservations in a given day than a restaurant that wasn't featured. When a restaurant was featured in a digest email, which had like 4 restaurants in it, it only got 9. But the reality of that is it got 9, but all 4 of them got 9. So actually by putting 4 in there, we had 36 incremental reservations to the B2B side of our business versus just the 12. So then what we said is, okay, let's do an analysis of like, based on the number of restaurants we put in a digest, how does same-day bookings change? And this was just like a very quick snapshot that we looked at. But we basically looked at up until like 15 restaurants, there were no diminishing returns. So we totally tweaked our email templates where instead of just having like one really compelling, like sexy image of a restaurant, we'd have like 15 little thumbnails of restaurants. You could barely see them. And from a performance vantage point, they just did tremendously better. We did the same thing with our homepage. We tested it in a lot of different places. These are all things that are pretty straightforward to do. Yep.
When you got to that point at that company where you made this thing over an X period of time, how many people were involved in that?
In executing the analysis?
I'm just like, I've got a startup. We've got about 25 people. I'm like, we're not in a position to do what you just described. Were there 7 of you? Were there 3?
A math major from a good college as an intern. That's who did this.
I don't mean the chart. I mean the whole thing.
Oh, sure.
We made this, we made that, we sent it out, we did the analysis. Blah, blah, blah.
So I would say like that's probably around the size company that people will start thinking about this thing. But a typical marketing team at that point might be like a marketing leader who's doing a lot of different things and 2 people who are completely in the weeds doing that. So when I talk about this stuff, I can tell you that a lot of this stuff when we started doing it, I had 2 full-time heads who were working on that team. As we scaled out, it ended up being closer to 5 heads. But it was 2 people working long hours, but knocking this stuff out. And again, like it's the cool thing is like there are economies of scale with that stuff. So the more people you get in there, the more specialized they can get, the better they get at doing that stuff. I can tell you like at the Ladders, it was the same thing. It was a 2-person marketing team when I started there. Now it's probably like 25. And again, they've gotten better at stuff as they've gone along because there's now someone who's like an expert on search and someone who's an expert on display and whatever else.